in the pending global reset. Left brain jobs will be wiped out by Google, robots, and outsourcing. The antidote is the unoutsourceable superpower of the flow state. Welcome to What the Flow, where we discuss making money easier, connecting deeper, and creating your own luck. And WTF, why we numb out, sabotage, and play small, and how to change it. It's Flow Time with Tony.
WTF, Tony Litster, What the Flow. Welcome to the podcast today. Today's episode is all about riding motorcycles in Kathmandu. And really, it's more about, can you do life the way you want to?
Oh my goodness.
So today, I want to talk about this experience I had when I was in Nepal on this spiritual adventure retreat that I did with what do we call it? I don't know. My friend Gerald Rogers and Alice and Larson, my business partners, we do these events. Well, prior to the corona, we did spiritual exotic retreats together in different parts of the world. And one of the ideas Gerald came up with during this event was to have a motorcycle adventure in Kathmandu. Now, if you haven't ever seen this, there's this Marvel movie. What's it called? It's Doctor Strange, I think. Yeah, Doctor Strange. And if you haven't seen it, you'll see what Kathmandu is like, what the streets are like, the chaos, the insanity. A bunch of that movie was filmed there. But if you haven't, it's worth a Google. And if you're not watching this on YouTube or on Instagram somewhere where it's on video, I'm going to splice in some actual footage of our motorcycle ride in Kathmandu. But if you can imagine hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of motorcycles all swirling about, and then trucks and cars and buses and, all kinds of strange looking vehicles that they've configured together. These are like crazy tractors that they've made where they'll like splice together a motor and some wheels and an axle from one vehicle and like a steering wheel from something else. And they have these like crazy tractors that they make where people like haul stuff around. And they drive on the opposite side of the road as we do here in the United States where I live. So it's like if you can imagine yourself deciding to actually engage in an activity like this, where you're going to be going opposite of what's normal for traffic for what you're used to, being on a motorcycle in the midst of swirling motorcycles all about you, and everybody seems to want to pass the next person, and they pass up the center lane. Meaning, with traffic coming in both directions, the motorcycles shoot the gap. They don't wait until there's no vehicle coming in the opposite direction. They shoot the gap when there is a vehicle coming in the other direction. And the motorcycles are equipped with with these bars on the where your knees are. Like you're going along and you're riding a motorcycle, your knees are kind of poking out, and all of the motorcycles have a little cage built out of steel that wraps around your knees to protect you from when you might bump up against another vehicle or another motorcycle or whatever else you might bump up against. So if you can imagine this idea coming up, and my friend Gerald, who loves to play and loves these little adventures, and he says, I've got this epic idea, we can do a motorcycle ride. And I instantly got scared. I won't pretend I didn't. There's like this 15-year-old ego-driven part of me that's like, oh yeah, I was like brave and I wanted to do this thing. No, I got scared shitless. And not just like a little bit. I almost didn't go, and I really checked in with my intuition and sat with myself in meditation for about a half an hour and really to like listened within me if this was something I felt was aligned in me, because the risks were real. And it's chaotic and it's crazy, and I really wanted to check in to see if it was an aligned experience that I wanted to have as a human being, and ultimately I decided that it was, and but it wasn't without going through some interesting emotional storms. And I think sometimes in life, like learning to trust our intuition And I know that I can just like hear people's voices on the other side, like, yeah, your intuition told you to do something risky and dangerous. I get it. Life is risky and dangerous, and you got to decide how you make your decisions on what you do. But in my case, I checked in with my intuition, and the answer was that I wanted to have the experience. And so I made sure a couple things. One, that I had a helmet, and then two, I actually downgraded the size of the motorcycle. Like some of the guys were on these bigger bikes, a kind of a Harley style, these Chinese-made Harley knockoff bikes that had big, wide handlebars. And I actually opted for like a little Vespa, like a scooter, because I didn't want to have the extra layer of chain, like actually using a clutch. I wanted a clutchless. And there was a part of me that like my ego identity of like, oh, I want to look tough like I'm on a Harley, that it struggled with it, but I aligned with my intuition, and that's what felt right to me. I'm really glad that I did that, because it ended up being the right choice for me. I've mentioned, I had a brain injury, and one of the activities that's been the very slowest to come back into my life was being able to ride a motorcycle, because of the amount of movement and the amount of all these moving parts to pay attention to, the amount of hyper focus that is riding a motorcycle. And so then adding that into riding that motorcycle on the opposite side of the road, and then adding that into riding that motorcycle in traffic like I'd never witnessed before, a swirling of moving motorcycles all around. So we ended up riding these motorcycles. We rented a bunch of them. We rode them up to the high up into the Himalayas. So we had to ride through town and then up out of town up to some beautiful resort that we stayed at for a couple of days, and had some spiritual adventures with the retreat people. And we did all those things. And on the way there, it was miserable for me. It was so much movement, so much chaos. And a couple times I went on the wrong side of the road. I just instinctively like pulled out. And then these cars are coming and they're like trying to figure out what I'm going to do. And then all of a sudden it dawned on me like, oh shit, I'm going the wrong way on the wrong side of the road. And I was just like peel off the side, and they'd be honking and passing me, all these things. And then when we came back on the second day, I had this remarkable experience. It wasn't unknown anymore. It wasn't chaotic. I mean, it was still chaotic, but it wasn't terrifying. And I started to actually discover that it wasn't even like weird. There was a flow to it. There was a rule to it. And that as I would go along, I realized that everybody, it was like going in a school of fish, and that the fish all responded to each other in this like fluid motion. I'd be where there'd be like in a small, like setting, there'd be 15 or 20 motorcycles in my within a stone's throw, like all like packed together. And we would all move in conjunction with each other. And sometimes we'd bump up against each other. It was very interesting to actually be riding and bumping into each other and not make it mean anything. And at one point, this bus was trying to ease its way into traffic, and they would just sort of like ease their way in, 1 or 2 miles an hour. They would just kind of bump their way in, and the motorcycle traffic started to squeeze to one side. And I was right next to the bus, and I was so close that I touched the bus with my hand and like scooted around it and made my way out of the way. And it was totally normal. There was no like adrenaline response or anything, because everybody was agreeing that that's how it was done. And I want you to think about this. There's a reason I'm bringing this up. And for those that are watching this on video, I've gathered up some footage, actual footage of our ride, so that you get a sense of this while I'm talking. But what happened was I was able to drop into the flow of what this traffic was, and it all made sense. And it no longer felt dangerous or chaotic. And all of a sudden it made sense to me why there were like whole families on motorcycles just going along and nobody was freaking out about it. How there were these just like thousands of people all around on these little scooters just buzzing around, because there was order. Even though when I first saw it, it looked like chaos. Now, contrasting that to riding a motorcycle in the United States, it's a completely different set of rules. or driving a car in the United States. It's a completely different set of rules. And there's this rigidity to the rule system where people get all bent out of shape if you don't follow the exact set of the rules, the way the rules need to be followed, and if you don't adhere to it the way that they expect you to adhere to it, you get road rage, and you get, people being angry, and you get, outrage, and all of this energy of demanding that something show up the way that we want it to show up because that's how it's done. There's this beautiful experience of, and I guess I suppose that happened in Kathmandu when I would drive on the wrong side of the road. I would get a confused response, not an outraged response. That is the one distinction and the one difference. I'd get a confused response, like the truck driver or the driver of the other vehicles would be like, "What the hell's going on? Hey, whoa, 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 whoa! You're not following the rules. You're not following the rules. Where are you going? Whoa!" They didn't know what to do. They like freak out about it. But I was having this conversation with one of my clients today, and this was sort of sparked this conversation that we're having here in the podcast. This is a person who lives his life very differently than how other people live their life. He's been extraordinarily successful in his business. And I'm not going to talk any details of his business because I want to protect his identity. He's been so successful, if I described his business, you could probably figure out who he was, and I want to protect that from him. But he does his life different. He sometimes likes to stay up playing video games until the middle of the night and sleep in till the middle of the morning. And he was shaming himself for it when I first started working with him 6 months ago. And he was like down on himself because sometimes he would get kind of into a depressed state. He's a hyper creative guy. But sometimes he would have a day or two where he'd just lay in bed depressed. And he didn't understand it. And he was down on it. And he started reading all these management books by the guy that managed, I feel bad, I'm going to not drop his name right. He was, it wasn't Lee Iacocca who did General Motors. It was Jack Welch who managed GM. So he's reading management books by people that manage some of the largest corporations and the most successful corporations in the world. And I'm like, bro, that's not you. There's probably some really good principles you can learn in there, but you are never going to be a guy that runs a corporation like that. You're never going to be someone that works in a corporation like that. Why are you taking management advice from people that don't understand you? Why are you reading books from people who don't have a clue how you operate? You're financially successful. You can do whatever you want in your life. So figure out what your flow is and get into that flow. And as he's done this, his manic side has kind of started to go away. He'll still have days where he's down. He'll still have days where he'll even stay in bed. He'll still have days where he plays video games until 4 o'clock in the morning and sleeps until noon. But he's not down on it because he's figured out that's also part of the genius. That's also part of the creativity. So we were having this conversation about how things ought to be, and we were talking about how different people in society, different like religions will say, well, it's got to be this way, and other religions say, no, it's got to be that way. And this whole thing of this social distancing is really fascinating. I think I talked about this on another podcast, but I had a client that lived in a part of the world where women had to cover themselves from head to foot. They could only show their eyes. And that my client, who was a woman, who was a leader among the women in her country and in the world, was commenting how there started to be this liberation, or women started showing up with their heads uncovered. And that the men who were in control of things were feeling things were getting out of control and they had to lock them back in place, but the women were no longer listening to those men. So what they did is they went and found women they could recruit to deliver that same message. So the women started shaming the women back into covering themselves in that society. And it was like this really interesting conversation of using ourselves against each other. And I've been watching this with social distancing. You have your own views on it. I have my own views on it. And I don't want to make this podcast about which views are right, because I don't know what's right. Just like you don't know what's right. But it's really interesting that there's not enough authorities to enforce different aspects of social distancing. In some places it's different than others. Some places it's so rigid and so extreme, and other places it's just a little bit of a general principle. But we're starting to use each other to shame each other and police each other into saying this is how it's got to be, whichever way we think, right? I use my pulpit to lean in the direction that I think it ought to be, and others use their pulpit to lean in the direction of the way they think it ought to be, and we shame each other for it. It's this really interesting thing. So anyway, so this conversation with this client led to this discussion of going, is there a right way and a wrong way to do life? And if you're a motorcycle rider here in the United States, and you ride a motorcycle a certain way, and there's certain rules of engagement on the road, then you expect things to show up a certain way and you ride accordingly. And if you're a driver in the United States, you expect things to be driven a certain way and you drive accordingly. But it doesn't mean it's necessarily right for everyone. Because if you drove that way in Kathmandu, you'd probably get hurt. You'd probably get in an accident. If you demanded that the other driver showed up the way that you can demand that they show up in the United States, then you would for sure get into an accident. I lived in the Dominican Republic with my family for a while, and I may live there again for a while. And driving in the Dominican Republic has this whole different set of rules. We had to explain to the kids, like here in the United States, like this town we live in, there's a big old sign when you enter the town and it says, "This is a walking community. Respect the walkers. Walkers have the right of way. If they're crossing the crosswalk or crossing the road, the cars stop." There's like some giant sign when you enter the town that says something like that. So here in this town, you can step out into the road and the cars will stop. But I had to explain to my children, whether we think that's right or wrong, or it ought to be this way or shouldn't be that way, I had to explain to them, I'm like, listen, that's not the rule here. If you do that, you'll get hit. They really won't stop. Why? Because they have the rule of the jungle there in the Dominican Republic. The rule of the jungle is the biggest animal is the king of the road. And the smallest animal has to accept that. So in the Dominican Republic, like the Greyhound bus and the Mack truck, they plow through those towns and everybody peels off the road and gets out of the way. The motorcycles get out of the way, the trucks get out of the way, the walkers get out of the way. Everybody peels out of the way, and those buses do not slow down. And they rip through town because they're the biggest. And everybody knows, and everybody gets it. And then when you're on this, then when you're in a truck, so like when I was there, I was driving a big Ford F-350 truck sometimes. And that's a pretty big vehicle down there. And so I would get the right of way no matter what. Well, my instinct was if somebody's on a motorcycle, since I like motorcycles, I want to give that motorcycle some room. I want to give them the right. I want to let them into the lane, let them merge, not make it hard, not run them into a pothole, not run them off the road. And so as I'm driving this big truck and we'd be coming into a roundabout or something and there'd be a motorcycle coming, I would slow down to let the motorcycle in. But it would confuse the motorcycle rider because I wasn't following the rules. And the rules that motorcycle rider were used to was that the big car just took the right of way, just took what it wanted, because that's what the big cars do in that society. That's how it's done right. And I would actually almost cause accidents because my impulse was, oh, hey, I'm always like looking out for motorcycles on the road. And I would actually cause them to almost get in an accident because I wouldn't behave the way they expected me to behave. I wasn't following the rules. I wasn't doing it the right way. And I had to learn to change my instinct and actually plow through so that everybody knew where to drop in. And then it was fine. Then there was order. There was order within that, even though I felt like it was abusive and obnoxious. If I drove like that in the United States, it would create road rage. It would create like a lot of like toxic feelings. So it's this interesting conversation of life that I've been thinking about. Which way is the right way? The right way. Which way is the way of doing it how it should be done? Because in Kathmandu, that second day of the ride when we came back, it was bliss. It was zen. it was this remarkable experience. It was joyful. It was like I was so present in the moment, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. I wish everyone could have this experience. I wish everyone could have this like flow state experience of movement and chaos and people coming in and out and honking and moving and just flowing with it. It was instinctive. It was so pure. It's funny, I'm wearing this shirt that says Pura Vida, which was from my Costa Rica thing, but it's like pure life. It was so pure to experience. And I'm so grateful that I have that awareness in my body and my being, my consciousness of having had that experience. And it felt like the right way. The right way. And I guess the point of today's podcast is maybe the right way is right for wherever you are. And maybe there's a way of doing life that works for you. Maybe it'd be okay if you do you and I do me, and we figure out how to live in peace with each other within that context. And maybe we spend a little bit less energy trying to demand that life show up the way we think it ought to show up, and we drop into the flow of the way life is showing up. Maybe we spend a little less of our energy trying to police each other and enforce a way of being that ought to be with each other. And we just get with the flow. We like drop into making it flow the way it works for us. And getting in with the flow of the way it works where we are. Right? If I drove in the United States the way that I drove in the Dominican Republic, I'd probably get a lot of tickets and have a lot of like confrontation on the road and probably cause some accidents. And if I drove the way I drive in the United States in the Dominican Republic, then I'll probably have a lot of problems on the road. And if I tried to ride a motorcycle in Kathmandu the way that I do in the United States or in the Dominican Republic, then I would have trouble with that. So play with this in your world today. Where are you resisting the flow of things? Where are you putting a lot of energy into demanding life ought to show up different than life is showing up? Where are you struggling with people just not getting with the program? And maybe you can just let them be people, and you can drop into the flow of your life and the bliss and have these incredible experiences of life just sort of like coming together and working, situations working themselves out, and allowing people to just be who they are and then trust that that's who they are, and not fighting it, letting them be who they are. And if that means you need to create boundaries and distance yourself because that's who they are, then take good care of yourself. Anyway, I wanted to share this. I hope for those that watch this on video, you enjoyed some of the insane footage of traffic there in the on our ride in Kathmandu. And look at how you can drop into the flow state today in the midst of chaos, in the midst of uncertainty, in the midst of changing things, and really find a moment of being with yourself and just allowing yourself to be yourself. I look forward to talking to you on the next podcast. In the meantime, create yourself a fantastic day.
If you're ready now to access the superpower of the flow state in your life, download the free mini course to learn the 3 easy steps of Tony's morning ritual. Now go and create some luck.